So now we're discussing the part 2 of our series of lectures on study designs. So initially we were just in an introduction where we are discussing different types of these study designs. But now we're going to in detail to discuss some of those study designs. So we start with the descriptive studies. So for our descriptive studies, as explained from the earlier lecture, the first type of descriptive studies, they are case reports. And what are case reports? Case reports, they're a detailed presentation of a single case or a handful of of cases. So usually for case reports, you can have case reports on some of the disease, but in most cases, case reports, they are based on a unique or a new finding. I think I gave an example of coronavirus initially, where the first cases were reported in Wuhan city in China. So generally, they focus on previous undescribed diseases. They also focus on unexpected link between diseases, unexpected new therapeutic effect, or even on advanced events. So case reports usually, they're like most of these things before, as I explained before, you have like a pandemic or a huge number of cases. Most of these things, they start as case reports. I also give a good example of side effects, for drugs. I give, for example, those who worked in the HIV program. I think we've got the side effects of drugs. I give, for example, a drug which is called efavirenz. It causes gynecomastia. Gynecomastia in males. Gynecomastia just means developing of breast. So usually those things, you don't really start by having the whole population of men on earth developing breast, but you have a few interesting cases which are unique. But later you have more of those of those cases. Then from case reports, now you go to case series. By case series, it means now you have got more of cases now, more of coming. So by case series, there's experience of a group of patients with similar diagnoses. I give an example of the efavirenz drug, also an example of the COVID cases. Initially there were a few, but later we have a lot of other many people are presenting with the same signs and symptoms. They assesses the prevalent disease. Then the cases may be identified from a single or multiple sources. So, for example, in the corona case, they started from one point, then they spread until we have a lot of cases which are now really reaching many parts of the country. Generally, case series, they report on new or unique conditions, maybe only realistic design for rare disorders. If you're studying something which is very rare, where maybe we can have one case or two cases, maybe with one case or two, not very many cases, it might not be possible actually for you to proceed further and do maybe some descriptive other descriptive epidemiology studies. Why? Because for you to do some of those things, you need a lot of cases. So for diseases which are very rare, actually a single case or even a case series might actually be enough to really provide the necessary understanding which is required for a disease or understanding a condition. What are the advantages of case series? Useful for hypothesis generation. Remember, as I said, those early findings actually where you see from a few cases, you can then use that to generate your hypothesis. They are very informative for very rare diseases with few established risk factors. So they characterize as averages for a disorder. Then what are the disadvantages? Remember, you are not really assessing the relationship between exposure and outcome. So because of that, you cannot study the cause and effect relationship. You cannot study the relationship between the outcome and exposure. So studying these two is important for you to understand causality. So because of you're just studying a few cases, it's then impossible for you to understand what's causality. You cannot assess the disease frequency, because for you to assess disease frequency, you need a lot, it's about numbers. It's about denominators. And if you've got a two, if you've got maybe one case in a population of 1 million, having that relationship doesn't really make a lot of sense. But for you to assess disease frequency, it means you need more of those, more cases of the same condition, so that whatever numbers you get, they'll be meaningful. So if it's one case, that's a case report. It's one case of an unusual finding. Then a case series. Now, what is a case series? A case series, you have multiple cases and of one quantity of one finding or one health event, which you are now writing about. Then for descriptive epidemiology, now it's population-based cases with a denominator. And when you are describing your things now, remember, we are looking at these are still your descriptive, is still you are now describing, the number of cases using the population as a denominator. We are describing who is affected, where are they affected, what time are they affected, and we are describing this based on the total population, which will be studied. And in this case, we are not assessing any relationship between exposure and outcome. So I think this one, your case series, your case reports, and your descriptive epidemiology, where you're describing, who is affected in terms of place, person, and time. These are the three elements of descriptive studies. Now we go to the next stage, where we are now describing analytic studies. So for analytic studies, remember, for analytic studies, we are assessing the relationship between exposure and disease. What is the link? What is the relationship between what exposure and the disease? How these two are linked? If someone is exposed, are they going to develop a disease? That's the whole concept of analytic epidemiology, where we are assessing the relationship between exposure and disease. So what are some of the basic questions which we are worried about in analytic epidemiology? Remember, as I said from the previous slide, is the link between exposure and disease. Some of the questions which we have in mind are, what is the exposure? We want to know, what is our exposure? Who are the people who are exposed? What are the potential or health effects of being exposed? What approach will you take to start the relationship between exposure and and effect? So these questions, they are very critical and they are very important in analytic epidemiology, in trying to decide which study design we are going to use to assess this relationship between exposure and disease. What are the study designs which fall under analytic epidemiology? We have our experimental studies. I think we've discussed this in the first lecture, where we are saying experimental studies. We've got our randomized control trial. Then we can have community trials, randomized control clinical trials. The difference between community trials and the randomized and community trials is the study participants. So community, you can actually randomize your communities, where you in another community you give an intervention, and in another community you don't give an intervention. But for randomized control, you can have your study participants or your level of whatever you will be studying. Is the individual, is the person. So that's the difference. That's the difference between between community and other trials, where you study, your level of study is the human being. We have our observational studies. And for observational studies, what do we do? You can use grouped data. If we are using grouped data, if we are using grouped data, we call those ones. Those ones are ecologic studies. So remember, in terms of study participants, in terms of study participants, instead of study participants, in terms of study participants, you can study people at individual level, or you can study participants at group level, where you're studying group. If you're studying individual level for observational studies, we have our cross-sectional studies, our cohort studies, our case control studies, and our case crossover studies. So I think those are the main types of our analytic studies. Experimental, we have our randomized control clinical trials, our community trials. Our observational studies, we have for grouped data, which is ecologic. And then at individual level, we have got cross-sectional, cohort, case control, and case crossover studies. So we're going to go in detail one by one for these studies. So experimental studies, I think we've designed these treatment and exposure occur in a controlled environment. It's a planned research design. Then clinical trials are the most well-known experimental design. And in clinical studies, we randomly assign what's our data. Then in community trials, in most cases, we don't usually randomize. So they are non-random. Then observational studies, they are non-experimental. The observation, because there is no individual intervention. We are not giving any intervention. That's why we call observation. Treatment and exposure occur in a non-controlled environment. Then individuals can be observed retrospectively, prospectively, or currently. And there's our observational studies. So we start with cross-sectional studies. So cross-sectional study is an observational study that surveys exposures in disease at a single point in time. So you are taking a snapshot and you are assessing your disease. You are just assessing the relationship between exposure and disease at a single point. It's a cross-section, and you're taking a snapshot. Remember, in the first lecture, where we were discussing the relationship, between disease and between exposure and outcome. If you are assessing those things at the same time, and you are not, I think you know that's where I was explaining the direction, and on that slide where I was explaining the relationship between these two. If you're assessing these two at the same time, we call it actually a cross-sectional study. In terms of time, the study only exists at this time point in time. There's no follow-up. There's no retrospective or prospective. They're just looking things at the same time. So this our cross-sectional study. This is our study population. If you study our population at once, we have our study population. What are we going, in terms of time, we are doing it once. In this study population, what are we going to see? We are going to find people with disease and those without what? Those with the disease and those without disease. Then from there now, we can now start implementing now our analyze now to really, that's where the analytic comes into, because let's say, I want to give an example of a cross-sectional study so that you understand. Let's say we want to assess, usually cross-sectional studies, they're called prevalent studies. And let's take, for example, you have, you want to, a cross-section of people. You take a community, you test them, and you are going to test them at once, at the same time for HIV. If you test them for HIV at the same time, you are going to realize some of them will be positive. the others will be negative. Then at the same time, you can also assess, some of the factors which might cause people to get HIV infection. Maybe it's use of condoms, maybe it's multiple partners. So yeah. So from that, you can actually say, from those with disease, the factors which might predispose us to getting HIV might be present or might be absent. For those without the disease, the factors might be present or might be absent. For those without diseases, the factors might be present or the factors might be present or absent. Then from there, you can then be able to do your analysis to see which of these factors might contribute to getting disease. To get it. So the concept is cross-sectional studies. They're also called prevalent studies. You are assessing exposure. You are assessing disease, presence of disease or no disease at the same time. We are also assessing the presence of factors which might cause diseases at the same time. The same time you are assessing what? You are assessing disease. So disease is usually, remember, we can use the word outcome and disease, they're the same. And then factor, it can be, we can also use the word what? Exposure interchangeably for those two. So cross-sectional studies, they are often used to study conditions that are relatively frequent with a longer duration of expression. They are non-fatal, chronic conditions. For those ones, we can use cross-sectional studies. Why is it important? Why the word long duration of expression is important? It's because if a condition, and let's say someone just has a condition, then they die, it means if you do a cross-sectional study and maybe the disease progresses fast and people die, it means the cross-sectional studies won't be helpful because remember we said it's a snapshot at a time point. So if a disease has a shorter period, it means by the time you do that, most of the cases would have succumbed to death. So a really cross-sectional study will not really give you much useful information. So it works for those diseases that have got a long duration of expression. It measures prevalence, not incidence of a disease. So you cannot, remember, if you do I hope you remember from the first lesson where we are discussing prevalence and incidence. So cross-sectional studies, they just measure prevalence of disease. I gave an example. They were with community surveys. I gave an example where you are testing people for what? For HIV. They are not suitable for studying rare or highly fatal disease or disease with short duration of expression. Why? Because you are doing this at a time point. So conditions with a short duration, it means they quickly disappear and from the radar. So it means if you try to do such a study, it won't be really helpful. And since the conditions will no longer be, the people have succumbed or the condition might have resolved or they might have cured or they might have been healed. What are the disadvantages of cross-sectional studies? The weakest observational studies. Why? Because they measure prevalence and they don't measure incidence. So in this case, they focus on prevalent cases that are survivors. Those cases that that die, it means they are no longer really part of the population. So you cannot really assess them because they are already out. Then the temporal sequence of exposure and outcome or effect may be difficult or impossible to determine. Why? Because you are assessing exposure and outcome at the same time. So you cannot really know which started, the what, and an egg or a chicken, that relationship. In terms of really for causality, for us to really say not using condoms predisposes people to get HIV. It means there should be a sequence of events where someone first they're HIV negative, they don't use a condom, they indulge into unsafer sex, and later they develop HIV. But if you assess this relationship at the same time, it will be difficult for us to see that temporal sequence and it could which chakatanga between those two. Usually you don't know when the disease occurred. You can't really use it to assess rare events or quickly imaging disease problem. Why? Because they quickly disappear within the population. we only be left with the prevalent cases. Then we have what we call ecological studies now. And this cross-sectional studies, which we are discussing, they focus on the human being, and we are looking at individual data. But for ecological studies now, these studies where exposure and data relating to whatever, what can I say? These are studies where exposure data relating to a place, these are examples, let's say hardness of water, which we collected on individuals, are correlated with health data collected on individual, but summarized by what? By places. So ecological studies, you are looking at summarized data or consolidated data of whatever study and of whatever issue we should be looking at. Conceptually, ecological component in this kind of study is an issue of data analysis, not study design. What is missing in this design is the relationship between exposure and outcome at individual level. And like you are looking at a condition, and you are looking at a disease or whatever event you are looking at summaries of data, not at individual level, but we are looking at in terms of places. And you can use places, you can use countries, you can use districts, communities, countries, regions. And for example, you are comparing regions. They gave an example of hardness of water, and in this slide we have an example of hardness of water. Maybe there's a relationship between hardness of water and some other outcome. And one of the communities, it has hardness of water. Another community doesn't have hardness of water. Maybe it's linked to tooth decay. So we can then actually, look at the number of people who are having tooth decay in one community as compared to the number of people having also comparing another community which is having tooth decay in another community. So we are not comparing the actual people, but we are looking at the numbers at community level, where these numbers we are having consolidated data as opposed to individual gene data. And this is the very important, the last statement. But what is missing is the relationship between exposure and outcome at individual gene level. Then remember, most ecological analysis, they are based on population and case series. Ecological analysis, they are subject to what we call ecological fallacy. And what is this ecological fallacy? Ecological fallacy, what can I say? You're going to read through these examples. Maybe let me read it through so that you understand it as I go through it. Imagine a study of the rate of coronary heart disease in capital cities of the world, relating to the rate to average income. Within cities studies, coronary heart disease is higher in richer cities than in poor ones. And then from this, we might predict from such a finding that being rich increases your risk of heart disease. But if you actually look now, if you compare in some of the industrialized world, the opposite is the case. Within cities such as London, Washington, Stockholm, poor people have a higher rate of coronary heart disease as compared to rich people. So in this case, what is the problem? The problem is you are taking data which is summarized, and you are taking data which is summarized at population level to then infer what you see at population level to individual level. But if you actually analyze it, and if you actually analyze at individual level, you realize actually people, and in terms of if you're comparing people coming from richer cities and those coming from poorer communities, people within richer cities, They know more. At least they are more conscious. They understand, issues of health eating, in terms of how to health eating, healthy, a proper diet, and all those issues is compared to people in poorer cities. So people in poorer cities, their eating habits, they actually predisposes them to coronary heart disease as opposed to those in richer cities. So if you are using this data of comparing cities and comparing the income and whatever, you might actually get wrong disease, which is opposite of actually what is happening. And this whole mistake where you compare what is happening at where you infer what is happening at population level to individuals, that is what we call ecological fallacy. And you are inferring you are inferring things at population level to individual level. One of the recent examples actually where this concept of ecological fallacy applies has been the issue of in COVID-19. I think you have heard where people are saying they are using population data to say in countries where there's BCG vaccination, people in countries where there is high rate of BC vaccination, there is lower risk of developing COVID-19. So which is actually wrong, because we are taking what is happening at population level to then infer that to infer that at individual level. And yes, at population level, we are seeing that, but at individual level, there are so many other things actually which predispose people to get corona, which have nothing to do with BCG vaccination. So I think there's still that debate, where people are saying, yeah, we have looked into countries and we realize that other countries where people are vaccinated, the rate of BCG vaccination are high, the rate of corona is cheap. But I think that debate actually has been solved, actually, where people actually realize, no, this whole concept of assuming, what's happening at population level, there might be something which not actually really related to what was and to BCG, which might be happening. So I think that's the main message, and in terms of this ecological fallacy. So I think for this one, let me end here. I will record another one where we discuss the remaining part of the remaining part of the remaining parts of the analytic studies. So in this one, we've focused on cross-sectional studies, where we discussed what are cross-sectional studies. Then we discussed in cross-sectional studies, it's a snapshot. You are doing your study at a time point, and you are studying the presence of outcome and exposure at the same time. And we realize these are some of the advantages, and these are the disadvantages of cross-sectional studies. And we also discussed ecological studies. And what we say, ecological studies, our unit of study is for ecological studies. We are not studying individuals, but we are studying at population level. And one of the errors, the mistakes which ecological studies have, is ecological fallacy. And what is this ecological fallacy? Ecological fallacy is what is we make a mistake of referring to what is happening at population level. We then assume that's what is happening at individual level. Then there's also another concept, ecological fallacy. Ecological fallacy is maybe before I conclude, there's also another concept which you also need to understand, which is what we call compositional fallacy. Compositional fallacy is the reverse of ecological fallacy. So by compositional fallacy, you are doing the reverse. You try to infer what is happening at individual level to assume that is the same which is happening at population level. Ecological fallacy. We are assuming what is happening at population level is what is happening at individual level. So please read through these slides so that you understand these issues in detail. Try also to look for other additional materials in other books so that you understand these study designs.